Sharks of the Corn? Virus Shark? Cocaine Shark? Sharktopus? Yeah, those are all real movies. Join me, Steve Coates, as each week I take a comedic look at the bizarre world of sharksploitation cinema on Bucket of Chum, the Shark Movie Podcast.
Welcome to Ouch! Was That a Ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liss.
Welcome back to Ouch! Was That a Ghost? This week I'm covering the Hinterkaifeck murders, or the Hinterkaifeck massacre. On a small remote German farm about an hour north of Munich, and behind, or hinter, the town Kaifeck, so Hinterkaifeck, on May 31st, 1922, 6 inhabitants were murdered. 5 were family members, and 1 was their maid. This is Germany's most notorious unsolved case, but there are plenty of theories. And it really feels similar to the Villisca axe murders I covered a while back. And there are theories that these murders were committed by the same assailant. This was only 10 years after Villisca. So the victims that lived on the farm consisted of Andreas Gruber, who was 63 years old. He was the patriarch of the family. He was a servant before transitioning into farming life. He was not a very well-liked person in the community, and he wasn't said to be a very nice man to his family. Then there was Andreas's wife, Cecilia Gruber, 72. She was married before, and her husband passed away before marrying Andreas. Andreas and Cecilia had a daughter named Victoria, who was 35. She married Carl Gabriel, and Victoria and Carl had a daughter named Cecilia. Unfortunately, Carl would die in World War I while in France in 1914, leaving behind his widow and his daughter. Then there was Joseph Gruber, another child. As for his parents, his mother was Victoria, but the father is not really clear who it was. Victoria was said to have hooked up with a neighbor who also lost his wife. The neighbor's name was Lawrence Schlittenbauer. And maybe Joseph was a result of this hookup. Now it's going to get uncomfortable. Lawrence claims he's not the father, but he knows who is. He claims that Victoria had been having incestual relations with her own father. And the paternity of Joseph became a big debate. After a few months of arguing back and forth, eventually Lawrence did legally claim Joseph as his child. And then there was the maid, Maria Baumgartner, age 44, who also lived in the house. This was actually her first day on the job. The family, like I said, lived in a really remote farm. They kind of kept to themselves. They were known as kind of odd. So the murders themselves took place on March 31st, but the victims were not discovered until April 4th. In the months leading up to that day, there were a lot of red flags, a lot of odd happenings, including the previous maid, I'm going to butcher this name, Krezenz Reig, who quit about 6 months prior. Many sources said that the reason for her quitting was that she believed that the house was haunted, because she kept hearing weird noises coming from the attic and voices. One day in March, the month of the murders, Andreas, the grandfather, and Victoria, his daughter, were on their property when they saw the figure of a man standing at the edge of the forest, just staring over at the farm. Later, Andreas found a Munich newspaper on the farm, which was a paper he never bought, but he sort of chalked this up to, hey, maybe the mailman dropped it on his route. So, to give context, the building structure on the farm was like an L shape. It had 4 connecting but separate structures. One area was from machinery. One area was for the barn, for animals and feed and all that stuff. And then they have the living quarters for the family. And then they had a small shed where they put an engine, for cutting hay or doing farming stuff. So still in March 30th, it had been snowing for a few days, and Andreas just did a little walk around the farm, and he was checking it out, and he noticed that the lock to the little shed where he kept the engine had been pried open. He also noticed that there were footprints in the fresh snow that started at the edge of the forest and went to the engine shed, but there were no footsteps going away. That same night, footsteps were heard in the attic. Andreas went up there, looked around, but he didn't find any intruders. Around this same time, some house keys went missing as well. It was just one thing after another, and the family just ignored it all. The next day, March 31st, Andreas and Victoria went into town to do some shopping. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this town. Andreas asked the mailman while he was in town and some neighbors about the strange things. But the mailman was like, no one in this area subscribes to a Munich newspaper, so there's no reason for one to be around here. And he told people about the strange man by the woods, the footprints, the keys, the footsteps in the attic, and people are like, hey, maybe you should tell the police. But Andreas was like, no, it's fine. They finished up in town, went back to the farm, and that evening, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the property. Her sister had accompanied her there and stayed for a bit, and then she headed home, not knowing that this would be the last time she would see her sister alive. The family being recluses and just kind of being looked at as odd, kind of outcasts, probably played a big factor into why it took 4 days for the victims to be discovered. On April 1st, 1922, 7-year-old Cecilia did not go to school. The same day, a few coffee salesmen went by the farm to take the family's order. They knocked on the door, the windows, they went around back of the house, which that's kind of a lot for a salesman. They did notice that the machine shed gate was open. Figuring no one was home, they just gave up and left. The next day, the entire family missed church, which was out of character. Victoria was supposed to sing in the choir, as she always did. A few more days passed, the family's mail was piling up, Cecilia kept missing school, and on April 4th, Albert Hoffner, a mechanic, was scheduled to work on an engine for the family. This was booked out. The family knew he was coming that day. So when he went, he claims he didn't see anybody on the property and he didn't hear anything on the farm, but he did hear farm animals and the dog in the barn. After he waited around for about an hour, he just got to work on the engine, which he worked on for about 4.5 hours. He told people about not seeing the family. This plus all the other absences of the family just spread around. People in the community began getting concerned. Lawrence that afternoon sent his 16-year-old son Johann and 9-year-old stepson Joseph to the farm to check on the family. They all seemed to have the same names. They went home and told their father they didn't see or hear the family. But Lawrence Schlittenbauer wanted to get to the bottom of it. So he got some friends together, Michael and Jacob, and he formed a little search party. They went to the farm to check for themselves. Michael and Jacob broke a gate to get into the locked barn. Inside the barn, under some hay, were 4 dead bodies. The grandmother Cecilia, who had been strangled and struck with 7 blows to the head. Andreas, who had his face beaten in so severely his cheekbones protruded out of what was left of his face. Victoria also had skull injuries, and 7-year-old Cecilia had a shattered jaw. She had neck and face wounds, and she was holding clumps of her own hair that had been ripped out of her head. The 4 bodies were stacked on top of each other in the barn under some hay. Then Lawrence walked around to the front door and just used his key and unlocked it. Inside of the house, he found the deceased maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her room with blows to her face and head. And then there was the youngest family member, deceased Joseph, in his bassinet with blows to his face and head. These eerie murders still unsolved to this day. Inspector George Reingruber and his colleagues from the Munich Police Department started the investigation. And of course, it was one of the old-timey crime scenes, all sorts of neighbors, nosy people that heard of the massacre. They totally contaminated the scene. Bodies were moved. The farm was trampled by dozens of crime scene enthusiasts, contaminating any clues the killer may have left as these 6 victims lay dead on the farm. Not that DNA was being used yet, but fingerprinting was common practice, but it wasn't even attempted here. The big question being, how did they get the 4 members in the barn and all get attacked without running? The way the building was set up, the house to the barn had like a hallway, but it was really narrow, so only one person could fit in it at a time widthwise. So if like 4 people went down that passageway, they would have to walk in a line. They couldn't fit side by side. So if the person in the front was attacked, the others would flee. So the only way to do this would be to lure them out there one at a time. One basic theory being that Victoria was lured to the barn, maybe by animal noises, and once in the barn, she was grabbed and attacked. Then Cecilia might have been in the kitchen, went to check on her daughter, who was taken a while, grabbed and attacked. And then maybe Andreas went to go check on the two women, and he was grabbed and attacked. Then 7-year-old Cecilia goes searching for her mother, grandparents, and she's also attacked. The bodies were stacked in the barn and covered with some hay. The attacker, who had to have been somewhat familiar with the farm and who resides there, then went into the house through the passage and killed Joseph as he slept, and then the maid in her room and covered her with a blanket. The one problem with this theory is that when they tried to recreate a person screaming in the barn as someone stood in the house, the person in the house couldn't hear the person screaming in the barn, so it's not clear how they were lured out there one by one. The day after the bodies were found, autopsies were performed on the bodies in the barn by the court physician. It was found that a mattock was most likely the murder weapon used. A mattock sort of looks like a pickaxe, but on this tool, one side the blade is horizontal, and on the other side it's vertical. They looked around the scene for the murder weapon, but it could not be found. They did find that most of the victims had died instantaneously, with the exception of Cecilia, the little girl, who was alive for hours after being attacked. And as she lay dying in the straw amongst her dead family in the dark, she was so terrified she tore clumps of her own hair out, found with these clumps in her hand. The skulls of the victims were sent to Munich to be investigated further. They later would go missing. The police suspected robbery to be the motive. They started questioning known robbers, traveling workers, laborers, vagrants. But this ended quickly when they found large amounts of money and valuables in the house untouched. There have been many theories about who committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. There was that the brand new maid had just started, and her sister was probably the last person besides the killer to see them alive. But for the sister to use the mattock, it's pretty heavy and it's very brutal. Not to say it's impossible. It's just, I don't know, maybe it's just really, really bad timing to start a new job. A big theory being that the perpetrator actually moved into the house for at least 3 days, living with the 6 corpses. While there, the killer is said to have eaten all the bread in the house, cut meat in the pantry, fed the animals, and on the night after the massacre, still 3 days before they were found, a man named Michael Plocky, saw smoke coming from the fireplace and saw the family's oven was being used. He claims to have seen a man by the forest, but the man intentionally held his flashlight in such a way that the witness didn't really see the person's face. The morning after the murder, a passing farmer and butcher claims to have seen 2 figures by the edge of the forest. When the 2 figures noticed the farmer and the butcher, they sort of hid their faces by turning them. After hearing of the murders, they came forward with this information, like, hey, those 2 guys might have been involved. Law enforcement, having no clear motive from the trampled crime scene, they tried to put together a list of suspects. They revisited all the odd happenings and just tried to talk to all the neighbors, get any information they could. 7-year-old Victoria told a school friend right before the murders that her mother, Victoria, was in some sort of domestic argument and ran into the forest, but was brought back a few hours later. Throughout the course of the investigation, over 100 suspects were interviewed. The testimony of the previous maid was a big part of this case. The one that quit 6 months prior that claims to have heard footsteps and voices in the house, leaving the job because of the possible haunting. This testimony made a ghost a suspect. Maybe the ghost was of Victoria's husband who had died in World War I. All the sounds in the attic may have been a squatter. Later in the investigation, officers found 2 hollows in the straw up in the attic, along with a displaced roof tile, which gave whoever was staying up there full view of the whole yard. Another theory being a murder-suicide based on the incest claims against Andreas and Victoria, but that was not consistent with the injuries. There was no self-inflicted injuries at the scene. Within a year of the massacre, the farm was completely demolished. When it was demolished, this revealed a hidden mattock in the attic, and a penknife was found in the hay in the barn. So let's go over some of the suspects. Carl Gabriel, who was the husband of Victoria, who was said to have died in World War I, leaving her a widow. His body was never recovered. I mean, that isn't impossible to happen in war, but it was the theory to go down. After the massacre, people started speculating whether he did in fact die in the war. Some people even claimed to have seen Carl in Soviet officer clothing after. Carl and Victoria's marriage was rocky, to say the least. He only lived with Victoria for a short while before going back to his parents' house while they were married. Maybe because he caught her in bed with her father. Who knows? I don't know. I wasn't there. Then there were the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. Their sister, on her deathbed, said that her brothers were the murderers at the farm. And by then, Adolf had already died. Anton was arrested, but the case against him was eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence. Then there was Carl and Andreas. See, I told you everyone has the same name. In 1971, a woman named Teresa claims that when she was 12, her mother was visited by the mother of Carl and Andreas, and she said that her children were responsible, and, quote, Andreas regretted that he lost his penknife, which may have been the penknife found at the farm when it was demolished, but the old maid that worked at the farm said that that was there before, and this whole thing went nowhere. Then there was Peter Weber. His former roommate and co-worker claims that Peter wrote him a letter telling of a family with an old couple, their daughter, and 2 kids. It said he knew about the incest. I don't know how or why that's relevant. But he asked his friend, like, hey, do you want to go kill this old man and take all of his money? And Peter never responded, so maybe he did it alone. But if he did, he didn't do a very good job at the robbing part because piles of money and valuables were still there untouched. The former maid also suggested maybe it was the Beichler brothers, Anton and Carl, along with another man named George Siegel. Anton worked on the farm before, harvesting potatoes, so at a minimum he had a basic knowledge of the layout of the farm. And the maid claimed that he was very open with his disdain of the family. He said they should all be dead. And the maid pointed out that the dog barked at everyone except for Anton. So maybe he was there more than once, maybe he stayed there, maybe there was some sort of familiarity there, if he was up there living in the attic. The maid claims that a stranger went to her window at night, which, how creepy is that? People just came up and talked to your window, whatever, maybe it was normal to them. But she thought it was Carl talking at the window, and she thought it may have been the brothers alongside a man named George Siegel that committed the crime, because George Siegel was known to have broken into the home before and stolen. Siegel also carved the handle of the murder weapon and knew where it would be, but I mean, not that that proves that much. The former maid also suggested the Thale brothers, who were known to break into local houses. She claimed that one night, Joseph Thaler went to her window. Okay, what is up with this window late night talks? There, he asked the old maid about the family, but she said she gave him no information, and while he was at her window talking like a creep, she claims that he knew where each family member slept, and he knew that they had a lot of money. And she said that somebody else was with him, and that they were eyeing the machine house. Then there was probably the most popular suspect, Lauren Schlittenbauer, the one that I mentioned earlier, who may be the father to Victoria's son Joseph. Lauren's claiming that Andreas may be Joseph's father. I mean, Andreas was charged with incest before. You know what's weird? They charged Andreas with incest, and he was found guilty, so both Andreas and Victoria had to serve time. Which, how messed up is that? But Lawrence did legally claim the child after fighting with Victoria's family, so I guess child support could have been a motive. He was looked at early on as suspicious. I mean, he set up a search party, he was there with his friends to investigate, and while the group had to break in through the gate to get into the barn because of the locks, Lawrence went around and used a key to open the front door to get into the house by himself, which was strange because house keys had gone missing, but who knows, Victoria could have given him a key if they were hooking up before, I don't know. But it was strange that he just went in by himself when he had friends there too, because I mean, a killer just slaughtered 4 that they found in the barn, and he has his friends right there that he could have been like, hey, let's go check the house. He just went in by himself. When he was asked about this, he claimed that he went in to try and find his son Joseph. And Lawrence moved the bodies around. Who knows what else he moved? He was alone after all. He also made a lot of comments about details that only the killer would know. And at one point, Lawrence stated that the killer tried to bury the family's remains in the barn, but the ground was frozen. I mean, who knows? Maybe the police said something, maybe he was guessing, or maybe he was the killer. There was the motive if he was trying to avoid child support, and I've seen mentioned financial gain. If he was Joseph's father and the only relative remaining, he might inherit the farm. Maybe this is why the animals were milked and fed and cared for. I don't know. But for years, others speculated that he was the killer, and he actually sued several people for slander for calling him the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. And he won. And then there's a theory put forth in the book, The Man from the Train, which was written by Bill James. In there, he suggests that the man known as Paul Mueller may be the killer. James referencing the similarities in Mueller's suspected crimes in the United States, and Mueller was said to be German, and maybe he went back to Germany when the US was getting too hot for him. There was one other weird little thing. In the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped at a male resident's house in Weidhofen, which was the town where Hinterkaifeck was located, in the middle of the night and asked him questions about the murder. And then he just screamed out, like, "I'm the killer, I'm the murderer." And then he just ran into the woods. And then the stranger was never identified. Like, that's odd. In 2007, 15 police academy students in Germany tried to solve the case using modern techniques. Each student individually agreed on one suspect, so it was a consensus among the 15 students. But the name was never released out of respect for the living descendants of this person. So maybe it is solved, but they just don't want to say it. Near the old spot of the farm is a remembrance shrine for the family. It's been over a century, and despite dozens of arrests, hundreds of interviews, no one has ever been charged. And the files were closed in 1955. The case has been studied by law enforcement, web sleuths, and it still remains Germany's most infamous unsolved crime. So who do you think it was? I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know on social media. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you need more content or just want to help support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com and search Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you need some snazzy merch, you can find it at crowdmade.com by searching Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you have a story you'd like to share, you can email it to ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. You can also find us on Facebook and all the other social media platforms under Ouch, Was That a Ghost?
Help me.
All links can also be found on ouchwasthataghost.com.